there is a ledge. Not a dramatic ledge. Not the kind of geological feature that stops you in your tracks and demands your attention from 100 yards away. A modest ledge, waist-high against the sandstone face, about 11 feet wide, positioned just above the tide line, where the harbor's breath reaches stone, but rarely swallows it. What stops you, if you are paying the right kind of attention, is not the ledge itself. It is what the ledge has been carrying for longer than anyone with a calendar has been counting. The surface has been worked. That sentence deserves a moment. Worked, not worn, not eroded, not shaped by water and wind in the patient, accidental manner that stone usually acquires its character. The grooves cut into this sandstone are too regular, too deliberate, cut to a consistent depth in a material that resists carving, a material that yields only to intention, to sustained effort, to someone who understood what they were doing and kept doing it. The edges of those grooves have softened over time. The exposed cuts have taken on the same amber-gray patina as the surrounding stone, the color shift that sandstone undergoes. When a fresh wound becomes old enough to stop being a wound and starts being part of the face. That color matching does not happen in decades. It happens over much longer stretches of time than decades. The men who arrived in January of 1788 would have seen this ledge. Some of them walked along that shoreline. Some of them ran a hand across the stone, felt the groove, understood at a registerable language that they were not the first to stand here. The First Fleet's records are meticulous. Journals, dispatches, official logs, personal diaries, 11 ships, more than 1,000 people. A colonial enterprise documented with the thoroughness of a government project. And yet the image that emerges from those documents, the image that has been reproduced and taught and repeated for 236 years, is of a vast, untouched wilderness. A blank page, a beginning. Stone does not participate in that narrative. Stone records what actually happened to it. And the sandstone of the Sydney Basin has been recording things for a very long time. Much longer than any document, much longer than any founding myth, much longer than the name Sydney itself, which was assigned to this harbor by a man honoring a British politician who never once set foot on its shores. What follows is a journey through 9 distinct threads of evidence, 9 lines of inquiry that the official account of Sydney's founding has consistently minimized, compartmentalized, or explained away with language that sounds authoritative until you push on it and feel it give. Each thread, taken in isolation, is remarkable. Taken together, they do something more significant. They make a case that cannot be answered by adjusting the timeline by a few years or acknowledging one overlooked archaeological site. They make the case that the civilization already present in the Sydney region when the First Fleet sailed through the Heads was not a footnote to history. It was the history, and the story that called itself a beginning was, in every meaningful sense, an interruption. Let's go back, much further back than 1788. The number 65,000 is genuinely difficult to hold in the mind, not because it is numerically complex. It is a straightforward 5-digit figure, but because it refers to years, and human beings are not wired to feel the weight of years at that scale. We process centuries with some effort. We understand millennia the way we understand the distance between stars, intellectually, not viscerally. But the story of Sydney begins there, not metaphorically, not as a rhetorical gesture toward a deeper history. 65,000 years ago, people were already living on this continent. The evidence for this is not theoretical, not inferred from a single ambiguous artifact. It is physical, dated, and published in peer-reviewed science. In 2017, a team of archaeologists working at the Majeji Bebi Rock Shelter in the Northern Territory published findings that repositioned everything. What they found in the stratified deposits of that site was not simply evidence of human presence at an early date. What they found was evidence of a culture that had already been operating for long enough to develop genuinely sophisticated technology. The oldest ground-edge axe technology on Earth. The earliest evidence anywhere in the world of grinding stones used to process seeds. The oldest known use of ochre for what appears to have been ceremonial or artistic purpose. These are not the tools of a people who just arrived somewhere and are still working out the basics. These are the artifacts of a people who have already cleared those hurdles, who have been here long enough to refine technique, to transmit it, to build a culture that uses it with purpose. Now hold that date against what was happening elsewhere on the planet. 65,000 years ago, Neanderthals had not yet vanished from Europe. The first anatomically modern humans had only recently begun to leave Africa. The city of Jericho, often cited as one of the oldest continuously inhabited places on Earth, would not exist for another 55,000 years. Agriculture as a human practice was still tens of thousands of years in the future. The entire span of what we conventionally call written human history, from the earliest Sumerian clay tablets to this moment, fits inside the last 6% of the time that Aboriginal Australians have been living on this continent. 6%. Sit with that proportion for a moment. Everything you studied in a history class, every empire, every revolution, every war, every cathedral, every printed book, every constitution, compressed into the final sliver of a story that was already ancient when Rome was founded. The Sydney Basin sits at the southeastern edge of this continental story. The people who inhabited it were not a monolith, they were a network of distinct groups, with distinct languages, distinct territories, and distinct relationships to the specific landscapes they managed. The Gadigal occupied the southern shores of Port Jackson, the body of water the British would rename Sydney Harbour. The Camaragal held the northern shores. Between and around them, dozens of clan groups formed the broader cultural world of the coastal region, a world connected not by political authority, but by kinship, by ceremony, by shared knowledge, systems, and by trade routes that crossed the continent. Their relationship with this land was not incidental to their culture. It was constitutive of it, meaning that the separation between people and landscape that European thinking tends to assume as a baseline was not, in their understanding, a separation at all. The land and the people were not two things that happened to occupy the same space. They were aspects of a single, continuous, living reality. What does 65,000 years of occupation leave behind on a landscape? It leaves behind managed ecology, the mosaic burning practices of Aboriginal Australians. The deliberate, systematic use of fire to maintain travel corridors, to encourage food plants, to shape the distribution of animal habitats across enormous areas, produced a continent so thoroughly altered by human intention that the earliest European explorers who described it as untouched wilderness were committing a profound misreading. They were describing as natural what was in fact the product of thousands of years of sustained care. The forests of the Sydney Basin were not accidental. The spacing of the trees, the distribution of species, the way certain plants clustered near water sources, these were outcomes, not accidents. They were the accumulated result of human choices made across hundreds of generations, by people who understood the landscape they were shaping with an intimacy that no one arriving from the outside could have recognized as knowledge, because it did not look like any knowledge system they carried with them. It also leaves behind architecture. This is where the standard historical narrative tends to either fall silent or speak in dismissals. The assumption embedded in colonial historiography, rarely stated explicitly but deeply operational, was that Aboriginal people had no architecture, no permanent structures, no built environment deserving of the name. This assumption was wrong when it was made, and the people who made it had access to evidence that directly contradicted it because some of them wrote down what they actually saw. In the Western District of Victoria, in a place called Budge Bim, the Gunditj Mara people constructed an aquaculture system using shaped volcanic stone. The system includes engineered channels, weirs, and holding ponds designed to manage water flow and control the movement of short-finned eels, eels that were harvested, smoked, and traded across enormous distances. That system has been dated to at least 6,600 years before the present. That is roughly 2,000 years older than the Great Pyramid at Giza. It was recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2019, not as a curiosity or an anomaly, but as an achievement of hydraulic engineering on a par with the great water management systems of the ancient world. In the same region, researchers have identified permanent stone structures, not temporary shelters, but buildings with walls and defined interior spaces, some with arrangements suggesting specialized functions. When the explorer Thomas Mitchell traveled through the Western District in 1836, he wrote of encountering Aboriginal settlements that he described as covering more ground than many towns in England. This was a man who had spent his career in the service of the colonial enterprise. He was not making an argument for Aboriginal rights. He was simply recording what he saw. The Brewarina fish traps on the Barwon River in New South Wales are among the oldest human constructions on Earth, possibly 4,000 years old or older, consisting of a network of interlocking stone weirs capable of capturing fish across multiple seasons and varying water levels simultaneously. Their design required an understanding of hydrology, fish behavior, stone placement, and seasonal variation that could only have been developed through generations of systematic observation and continuous refinement. None of this happened in a world disconnected from the Sydney Basin. The people who built these systems were part of the same extended cultural tradition that shaped the land around what is now Sydney Harbour. They were connected to the coastal communities of the Sydney region through trade routes, through kinship networks, through the sharing of knowledge and ceremonial obligation across the full breadth of the continent. When Arthur Phillip sailed into the harbor in January of 1788, he was not arriving at an empty shore. He was arriving at the terminal point of the longest unbroken human civilization on Earth. A civilization that had built and managed and shaped and named every feature of the landscape he was sailing through. The harbor he called Port Jackson already had a name. The name was Caddy, given to it by the people whose ancestors had been living on its shores since before the harbor existed in its current form, since before the sea rose and drowned the river valley that is now the harbor floor 10,000 years ago. The cove he chose for his settlement already had a history so deep it extended below any horizon he could have imagined, and the sandstone he built on was already carved. There is a particular way that the word engineering tends to get deployed in conversations about ancient civilizations. It appears when we talk about Egypt and the precision of the pyramids. It appears when we talk about Rome and the aqueducts. It appears when we talk about the Indus Valley cities and their remarkably sophisticated drainage systems. Engineering, in the conventional historical narrative, is something that happened in those places, in those periods, and then spread outward from those centers of innovation. The story of Aboriginal Australian hydraulic engineering requires us to rethink that geography of innovation entirely. The Bujay Bim aquaculture complex deserves to be understood not as an interesting regional curiosity, but as one of the great engineering achievements of the ancient world. The Gunditj Mara people did not stumble upon an effective method for trapping eels and then repeat it indefinitely. They designed a system. They refined it over time. They operated it continuously for more than 6,000 years, a span that dwarfs every civilization that built the monuments we routinely celebrate as the evidence of human ingenuity. The engineering problem they solved was genuinely complex. The land around what is now Lake Condah in Victoria is shaped by ancient lava flows that create a topography of channels, basalt ridges, and seasonal wetlands whose behavior changes substantially with rainfall variation and seasonal flooding. Managing that environment to maintain a reliable harvest of short-finned eels, creatures whose migratory patterns follow specific temperature and seasonal triggers, required an understanding of the relationship between rainfall, runoff, wetland extent, and eel movement that could only be built through generations of systematic observation. The channels they cut into the basalt direct water from the seasonally flooded wetlands through a series of weirs and holding ponds in sequences timed to the eel's movements. At specific points in the seasonal cycle, when the eels would naturally be moving, the system funnels them into holding ponds where they can be harvested sustainably, enough to feed large populations, to smoke and preserve, to trade across the continent. but not so many that the population is depleted before the following season. This is not subsistence fishing. This is managed aquaculture, operating on principles that a modern fish farmer would recognize immediately. The permanent stone houses found near the Bujay Bim complex tell a further story. These were not mobile populations temporarily exploiting a seasonal resource. They were settled communities maintaining a sophisticated food production infrastructure across deep time. The Brewerina fish traps on the Barwon River are the other great example from the extended cultural world of the Sydney region. And they operate on a different engineering logic that is no less impressive. The Barwon River changes substantially across seasons. Its flow varies, its depth changes, its relationship to the surrounding floodplain shifts. The fish traps at Brewerina were designed to function across this variability, not despite it. The system consists of a series of stone chambers arranged in a pattern that channels fish from the open river into successively more confined spaces as the water level changes. At high water, fish can move over the walls freely. As the river drops, they find themselves concentrated in holding pools. Different chambers capture different species that prefer different water depths. The whole arrangement works across a range of conditions that a fixed structure could not accommodate, suggesting that its designers understood the river's behavior across its full seasonal range and built that understanding into the system's geometry. The stones used in the Brewerina traps include material that is not local, transported from significant distances, suggesting that the construction of the traps involved not just the engineering, intelligence of one community, but the coordinated effort of multiple groups, potentially over an extended period of time. For Sydney specifically, the hydraulic management of the harbor and its surrounding watershed was the foundation on which everything else rested. The Eora people of the coastal zone maintained fish traps and weirs at specific points in the harbor and its tributary estuaries. Some of these structures were still visible and in use when the first fleet arrived, and they were noted in the early colonial records, though typically noted in the way you note a curiosity rather than the way you note a functioning piece of infrastructure. Governor Phillip himself, in his early dispatches back to London, described fish traps in the harbor that he attributed to the indigenous inhabitants. He framed them as evidence of the local people's understanding of the water and its resources. He did not frame them as engineering. He did not frame them as infrastructure, but that framing is exactly what they deserve, because the management of harbor fish populations through positioned weirs requires an understanding of tidal behavior, fish movement patterns, and seasonal variation that is sophisticated by any standard. The Tank Stream, the small freshwater creek that Phillip chose as the water supply for the settlement, and that gave Sydney Cove its practical viability as a colonial site, was not a pristine natural resource accidentally discovered by the arriving colonists. It was a managed water source in a managed landscape. The Aboriginal people of the harbor region had been maintaining the catchment that fed it, managing the vegetation along its banks, and using it within a broader water management system for thousands of years. The colonists found the tank stream running clean and clear in January 1788. By 1790, they had contaminated it with waste and were already seeking alternative sources. The contrast between the management regime that had maintained it and the one that replaced it is not a minor historical irony. It is a precise demonstration of the difference between ecological knowledge accumulated over generations and the absence of that knowledge. Water management is perhaps the most telling indicator of a civilization's understanding of its landscape, because water does not tolerate mismanagement the way that some other resources do. You cannot bluff your way to a functional weir system. The physics of water flow do not accommodate wishful thinking. A hydraulic engineering achievement that sustains a population for 6,000 years is not a lucky accident. It is the product of a civilization that solved the hardest problems of sustainable resource management long before any of the civilizations we routinely celebrate as the inventors of such management had begun to ask the questions. Beyond the specific hydraulic structures, the landscape management tradition of the Sydney region operated at a scale that requires a different kind of vocabulary to describe. The mosaic burning practices, the deliberate use of fire to maintain specific vegetation patterns across large areas, produced a landscape that the first colonial surveyors described as park-like, open, easy to travel through. They found it convenient and assumed it was natural. They were wrong on the second count because it was entirely the product of human management. And that management was what made their own expansion possible. The forests that the colonists moved through were not wilderness forests. They were maintained forests, forests where human hands had been making choices about what grew where for thousands of generations, accumulating the results of those choices into a landscape of extraordinary ecological richness and navigable structure. The roads that grew out of the colonial period in the Sydney region frequently followed Aboriginal pathways that had been maintained through exactly that kind of landscapes management. When you walk through the bush outside Sydney today and find it open, navigable, structured in a way that feels almost intentional, it is often because it was intentional. Because the land carries in its vegetation patterns the memory of management practices that predate the colonial period by an expanse of time that the colonial period itself has barely begun to acknowledge. Hawkesbury sandstone is a particular kind of rock. It formed from sediments deposited approximately 250 million years ago, during the Triassic period, when the land that would become the Sydney Basin was the floor of a broad river delta. The sediments were compressed over geological time into stone that has a quality uniquely suited to a certain kind of record keeping. Hard enough to resist casual weathering, soft enough to be worked with the right tools, it holds an edge. A groove cut into Hawkesbury sandstone 2,000 years ago is still a groove today, still readable, still carrying whatever meaning was cut into it by the hands that shaped it. The Sydney Basin contains one of the densest concentrations of rock art anywhere on Earth. That statement is not a regional boast. It is a finding that researchers in this field return to consistently, And what makes it striking is not just the density, but the nature of the records themselves. Tens of thousands of individual engravings, paintings, and arrangements have been documented across the region. The National Zoo and Wildlife Service has recorded more than 5,000 rock engraving sites in the Sydney Basin alone, and researchers who work in this field are consistent in saying that documented sites represent only a fraction of what exists, that survey work continues to add sites each year, and that the full extent of the record written in the stone has not been established. Ku-ring-zai Chase National Park, on what is now the northern outskirts of the city, contains some of the most extensive and best preserved of these engravings. Walking the tracks through that bush, you come upon flat sandstone surfaces where figures have been cut, not scratched, not faintly incised, but deliberately cut to consistent depths that indicate the use of specific tools applied with controlled, sustained pressure. Life-size human forms, whales rendered with anatomical specificity sufficient for researchers to identify the exact species depicted. Not a generalized whale shape, but a particular whale, observed closely enough that someone understood the geometry of its body with precision. Kangaroos, emus, sharks, fish. Geometric shapes that do not correspond to animals or humans, but whose regularity speaks of intention and system. Spirals, lines extending across meters of flat rock surface, connecting one image to another in spatial relationships that researchers are still working to decode. The scale of individual engravings at the major sites is striking. Some figures cover areas of 20 or 30 square meters. The preparation of the sandstone surface before carving, the smoothing and clearing of the rock face that precedes the cutting of the images, is itself evidence of planning, of a project conceived in advance and executed over time. The orientation of the platforms on which the engravings appear is not random. They tend to occupy specific elevated positions with particular orientations, frequently facing east, frequently with clear sight lines to the horizon or to specific geographic features. These were not accidental settings. They were chosen. Consider what it takes, organizationally, to create thousands of large-scale prepared engravings on sandstone surfaces distributed across a region the size of Greater Sydney. Someone, across many generations, has to decide this is important enough to do and keep doing it. The skills of stone preparation and engraving have to be transmitted from older practitioners to younger ones, with sufficient precision that the work maintains its character across centuries. The sites have to be visited, maintained, added to, protected. Resources have to be allocated. Time has to be set aside. This is not the description of a society operating at the edge of subsistence. This is the description of a society that has solved the problems of subsistence sufficiently to invest significant collective energy in cultural production of a sustained, technically demanding, multi-generational kind. The cognitive surplus required to build and maintain a record system of this scale is exactly the kind of surplus that in any other cultural context we would describe without hesitation as the mark of a sophisticated civilization. The Darebin Guringai communities are the custodians of much of this rock art, and within their traditions, the engravings are not historical artifacts. They are a living connection to country, to the ancestors who created the images, to the knowledge systems encoded in the arrangements. That understanding has persisted through 236 years of colonial pressure that included the physical destruction of sites, the forced removal of people from their country, the suppression of language, and the systematic attempt to replace Aboriginal knowledge systems with European ones. The fact that the knowledge has survived, damaged, reduced, but alive, is itself a form of evidence about the civilization that produced it. Knowledge systems that survive that degree of deliberate disruption do not do so by accident. They survive because they are embedded in communities with a depth of commitment to their preservation that overrides extraordinary external pressure. What the knowledge holders say about the engravings, to the extent that it has been shared publicly, is consistent and clear. The images are not decoration. They are not primitive art in the diminishing sense that 19th century commentators use that phrase, treating non-European cultural production as charming evidence of an early developmental stage. They are records. They are instructions. They are maps. Not maps in the coordinate and scale sense, but maps in the sense of organized spatial knowledge about relationships that matter. But there is another layer of what the engravings communicate. A layer that sits alongside the cultural knowledge of the people who created them and does not contradict it, but adds a different kind of texture to our understanding. The physical evidence of the engravings tells us about the civilization that produced them in the way that any significant construction project tells us about its builders. It tells us about the organization of labor. It tells us about the transmission of technical knowledge. It tells us about what a community decided was worth sustained investment. When Arthur Phillip arrived in 1788, he was building on land that already carried this record. The streets and buildings and institutions that grew up over the following 2 centuries were laid over a palimpsest, a surface written on many times in which the most recent writing sits atop layers of older inscription that remain present even when they are not visible. The city did not ask what was underneath it. The sandstone, with the patience characteristic of very old things, has simply gone on holding its answer. There is a quality of presence at the engraving sites that is difficult to convey in purely analytical language. Stand on one of the Ku-ring-gai platforms on a still morning and look at the whale cut into the stone. It has been there longer than Australia as a nation has existed. It will be there long after the newest CBD tower has been replaced. The stone remembers what documents do not because memory is a property of stone in any mystical sense, but because stone is an honest medium. It records what was done to it. It holds the record without editorial judgment. And the record it holds in the sandstone of the Sydney Basin is a record of cultural investment so deep and so sustained that the standard historical account of this city does not have an adequate framework to contain it. About 80 kilometers north of Sydney, in the sandstone country of the Central Coast, there is a valley in Brisbane Water National Park. where something has been carved into the rock face that does not fit neatly into any of the established categories of Australian prehistory. The inscriptions are known as the Gosford glyphs. They have been known to the research community since the 1980s, and to broader public attention since the 1990s. And they have been generating argument ever since. The glyphs, cut into two adjacent sandstone surfaces, bear a striking resemblance to ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, not a vague resemblance. Not the kind of pattern recognition that finds faces in clouds or meaningful shapes in random marks. A resemblance that trained Egyptologists have been unable to simply dismiss, even when they have been most committed to dismissing it. Because the characters correspond to specific identified glyphs in the ancient Egyptian writing system, and they are arranged in sequences that follow the structural logic of Egyptian text, including the directional conventions that indicate how a text is meant to be read. The official position of Australian archaeology is that the Gosford glyphs are a modern hoax. This position is stated with considerable confidence. What it is not stated with on examination is adequate supporting evidence. The primary argument for hoax begins with the conclusion that ancient Egyptians could not have reached Australia. This is, in the strictest logical sense, a circular argument. It starts with the conclusion and uses the conclusion as evidence against any finding that contradicts it. It does not engage with the physical evidence of the glyphs themselves. It does not address the weathering, the depth of the cuts, the patina development on exposed surfaces. It asserts impossibility and then treats any apparent evidence of the impossible thing as necessarily fraudulent. The secondary argument notes inconsistencies in the glyphs, apparent errors, anachronisms, departures from what trained Egyptologists would expect. This argument has more substance, but it is complicated by a significant fact. Ancient Egyptian writing systems evolved over approximately 3,000 years of continuous use. Regional variations existed. Scribal traditions differed by period and by context. The identification of an error in a specific Egyptian inscription requires a level of certainty about the correct form of the inscription that Egyptology is not always in a position to provide, particularly for texts that, if genuine, would date to the Old Kingdom, where the corpus of comparative material is limited. In 2011, an Egyptologist named Mohammed Ibrahim and a researcher named Abdul Hakim Ayan offered an interpretation of the Gosford glyphs that attracted significant attention. Their translation proposed that the glyphs recorded a memorial inscription, the account of an Egyptian expedition that had reached Australian shores, become stranded, and died here. They identified specific phraseology consistent with Old Kingdom funerary texts, and their reading was detailed and internally consistent. The response from mainstream archaeology was swift, comprehensive, and in some cases notably ungentle. The researchers were described as incompetent. The translation was called wishful thinking. The site was declared a certain hoax, deserving no further scholarly attention. What the rejection did not produce is instructive. It did not produce a character-by-character analysis of the inscriptions demonstrating specifically why the translation was wrong. It did not commission independent geological analysis of the patina and weathering of the cuts to establish when the carving was made. It did not identify a specific person or group responsible for the alleged hoax. It did not explain how someone with the technical knowledge required to produce convincing Old Kingdom hieroglyphs could have executed that work on a steep sandstone cliff face in a remote national park at some point in the 20th century without leaving any trace in local memory or historical record. The weathering question matters enormously and has not been adequately addressed. Sandstone weathers at measurable rates. The degree to which the edges of a cut have rounded, the extent to which exposed surfaces have developed a matching patina, the depth of differential weathering between cut and uncut surfaces. These are all quantifiable characteristics that can give a reasonable indication of a carving's age. A cut made in 1990 looks different from a cut made in 1890. A cut made in 1890 looks different from one made 4,000 years ago. Several independent researchers who have examined the Gosford glyphs in person have described the weathering as inconsistent with a 20th century origin. No study commissioned by official archaeological or heritage bodies has been published that addresses this question using the full range of available dating techniques. The broader context for the Gosford glyphs is the question of whether ancient maritime cultures had the capacity to reach Australia before European contact. This is treated as settled by academic archaeology, but the evidence continues to complicate that settlement. Trade goods of demonstrably distant origin appear in Australian archaeological sites across the continent. The Makassar traders of what is now Indonesia are known to have visited the northern Australian coast for centuries before 1788. Not as a theoretical possibility, but as an established fact, documented in both their own historical records and in the cultural and material record of the Aboriginal communities they visited. The coast facing Southeast Asia is not a barrier. It is a series of islands and shallow seas that experienced navigators have been crossing for millennia. If Makassar traders were making regular voyages to Australia centuries before Cook, the question of whether earlier maritime cultures from further afield might have done the same is not inherently implausible. It is the kind of question that deserves investigation rather than dismissal. Whether the Gosford glyphs are what their most ambitious interpreters claim or something else entirely, a colonial-era scholarly prank, a modern fabrication, or something in between, the sandstone of the Central Coast holds its record with the same patient indifference it has always maintained. The stone does not particularly care about the argument. It has been here longer than the controversy and will outlast it considerably. In the archives of the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris, there are maps. They were produced primarily between 1530 and 1566 by cartographers working in and around the Norman port city of Dieppe, and they are known collectively as the Dieppe Maps. They are beautiful documents, painstakingly illustrated, technically accomplished by the standards of their period, and remarkable for what they appear to show. On several of the Dieppe maps, south and east of the known Spice Islands, there is a large landmass. It is labeled Have la Grande on several of the maps. Its size is consistent with a continental landmass rather than an island. Its position in the globe is consistent with where Australia sits, and its coastline, in the sections that appear most detailed, has features that some researchers have matched to specific recognizable landmarks on the eastern Australian coast. What may be representations of the Gulf of Carpentaria, Cape York Peninsula, and the coastline below it. If these identifications are correct, and if the maps were based on actual survey data rather than on cartographic invention, then European knowledge of the Australian coast predates James Cook's famous voyages by approximately 250 years. The implications for the narrative of European discovery that underpins the legal and historical justification for British colonization are significant. The mainstream position of cartographic history is that Have la Grande is not Australia, that the resemblances are coincidental or the result of cartographers filling unknown space with imaginative constructions, as was common practice. This position has serious scholarly support. It also has a serious scholarly challenger. Kenneth Gordon McIntyre, an Australian diplomatic historian, spent years researching this question and published his findings in 1977 in a work titled The Secret Discovery of Australia. His argument built on extensive archival research and detailed comparison of coastal features in the Dieppe maps with actual Australian geography made the case that a Portuguese expedition under Cristóvão de Mendonça surveyed the eastern Australian coast around 1522, and that the Dieppe maps incorporated the charts produced by that expedition. The mahogany ship adds a physical dimension to the question that has resisted easy dismissal. Near the town of Warrnambool on the Victorian coast, multiple witnesses across the 19th century reported the remains of a vessel of unusual construction, partially buried in coastal sand dunes, built of dark, dense hardwood not native to the region, of a design inconsistent with the European ships of the colonial period. The vessel appeared and disappeared as shifting sands exposed and reburied it. No confirmed physical remains have ever been recovered. But the consistency of witness descriptions across different decades, and the agreement on specific features, has kept the mahogany ship in the category of unresolved historical questions rather than dismissed legend. Oral traditions of Aboriginal communities along the Victorian coast include accounts of contact with people arriving by sea in large vessels at some point before British arrival. These traditions were documented by early colonial observers. They exist in the written record, not only in contemporary oral transmission. For Sydney specifically, if European navigators were surveying the eastern coasts in the early 16th century, then the question of what they observed and described takes on new dimensions. If there were already structures visible from the water, fires in the night, organized settlements distinguishable from casual camps, and the evidence of the rock art and the hydraulic infrastructure suggests there were, then records of such an expedition, if they exist and have not been destroyed, would contain observations of Sydney Harbour as it appeared 2.5 centuries before 1788. The Portuguese were deeply secretive about new geographic discoveries. The deliberate suppression and destruction of maps and voyage records was standard practice. If an expedition surveyed the Australian coast in the early 16th century, the records may have been classified, may have been destroyed, or may still exist somewhere in Portuguese or Vatican archives in forms not yet fully investigated. None of this is evidence that it happened, but it is a reason for the kind of historical humility that the founding narrative of Sydney has not always demonstrated. Beneath the streets of Sydney, there is another city. This is not a metaphor. It is a geological and archaeological statement about what exists under the concrete and asphalt, and tram tracks and heritage-listed foundations of one of the most intensively developed urban environments in the southern hemisphere. In the sandstone bedrock beneath the central business district, beneath the Victorian terraces of inner Sydney, beneath the parks and harbour foreshore paths, there are passages. Some are documented, mapped, maintained as part of the city's infrastructure. Others are less well known, encountered during construction and sealed again because the schedule of a building project does not permit the extended investigation that what was found would warrant. The story of underground Sydney begins with water, because water is why the settlement was placed where it was. Arthur Phillip chose Sydney Cove specifically because it had access to fresh water. A small creek running through the low ground behind the shoreline, clean and reliable enough to supply the settlement. That creek, the tank stream, became the central water supply for the early colony. The tanks cut into the sandstone along its course to store and distribute water gave it its name. The tank stream is still there, enclosed in a culvert, carrying stormwater rather than drinking water, running from its origin near present-day Hyde Park to Circular Quay, where it enters the harbour. It runs beneath the most visited square mile in Australia. Most people who walk above it every day have no idea it exists. But the tank stream is not the only channel in the sandstone below central Sydney. During construction projects across the central business district over the past century, builders and engineers have consistently encountered cut stone passages and chambers in the sandstone that predate any documented colonial construction. The standard interpretation attributes these to the early colonial period, to a time of convict and soldier construction, under conditions of urgency and resource scarcity that did not permit systematic record-keeping. This attribution may be correct in many cases. The early colonial period involved an enormous amount of informal construction, but some discoveries have been harder to account for in those terms. During construction of the MLC Center in the 1970s, workers encountered a system of cut sandstone passages at a depth inconsistent with colonial-era origin. The discovery was noted, some documentation was made, and construction continued. During excavations for the Museum of Sydney Expansion in the 1990s, layers of occupation were found beneath the foundations of the first government house site that extended deeper than the colonial period accounts for, with material culture present in lower strata that required explanation. The official interpretation was that the material had been disturbed and redeposited by later colonial activity. This interpretation is possible. It is also the interpretation easiest to reach when extended investigation is not available. The Hyde Park Barracks excavations are more thoroughly documented and demonstrate what becomes visible when systematic archaeology is actually applied to Sydney's urban fabric. When the barracks were converted to a museum in the late 1980s, archaeologists had the opportunity to excavate the site in detail. Post holes, hearths, and material debris of Aboriginal occupation were present in the lower stratigraphic layers. The way the landscape had been used and modified by Aboriginal people before the barracks were built was recoverable from those lower layers. The Hyde Park Barracks excavation matters not just for what it found, but for what it demonstrated about what had been routinely destroyed without investigation in the construction of the colonial and post-colonial city. Every time a building was demolished and a new one built, the upper layers of urban archaeology were disturbed or removed. This process has been running for 236 years. The city has been continuously erasing the record of what was here before it, not deliberately in most cases, but structurally, as a consequence of how cities grow and rebuild on their own foundations. The tunnel tradition in Aboriginal culture of the Sydney region is not extensively documented in academic literature, but it exists in oral traditions of the relevant communities and in accounts of some early colonial observers. The Gadigal people and their neighbors knew the sandstone landscape intimately, including its caves, overhangs, and the passages that form naturally in certain geological formations. In a landscape where stone can be worked with relative ease, the line between natural passage and constructed passage is genuinely ambiguous. And the ambiguity makes it easy to classify everything as natural and stop asking questions. What is clear is that the city of Sydney was built on, over, and through a landscape that had been shaped by human hands for thousands of years before the first colonial shovel went into the ground. The evidence of that shaping has been incompletely recorded at best, and what lies beneath the streets is a palimpsest, a document written over and over on the same surface, in which the earlier inscriptions are still present for anyone who knows how to read through the more recent layers. The circular quay area, the symbolic and logistical heart of Sydney, the most photographed foreshore in the country, is also one of the most archaeologically layered. The original shoreline of Sydney Cove was significantly further inland than the current waterfront. Land reclamation that began in the colonial period and continued intermittently through the 19th and early 20th centuries pushed the shoreline to its present position. Below the reclaimed land and below the original colonial foreshore, the sandstone bedrock carries the traces of its pre-colonial use in forms almost entirely invisible beneath the modern urban surface. The specific Aboriginal heritage sites documented in the early colonial period around the central business district have been almost entirely destroyed by subsequent development. The cleared ceremonial ground that early observers noted near the tank stream was built over in the first years of settlement. The rock art that Watkin Tench described in the vicinity of the settlement did not survive the quarrying operations of the early colonial period. Presumably ground into rubble and used as building material, its surfaces obliterated in the process. This is the most literal version of what happened. The aboriginal landscape of the Sydney region was quarried to provide construction material for the colonial city. Its worked surfaces were buried in walls and foundations. Its cultural significance was converted into structural utility. The sandstone of Sydney's oldest buildings is in many cases the same sandstone that carried Aboriginal engravings before the quarrying began. The city is built from its own prior history, and the history is in the walls. Invisible because it was placed in positions where it could not be seen. The work of Sydney's urban archaeologists over the past 3 decades has fundamentally changed what is knowable about what was here before 1788. Mandatory archaeological assessments now required before significant development can proceed have produced a body of knowledge vastly more detailed than what was available a generation ago. The knowledge exists. It sits in heritage assessment reports and university libraries and archaeological publications. The gap between what archaeology knows about pre-colonial Sydney and what the city's public culture acknowledges is not a gap of knowledge. It is a gap of attention. On a basalt plain in the western district of Victoria, in a place called Wurdi Yuang, there is an arrangement of stones that has been drawing the sustained attention of researchers for several decades. Roughly 100 basalt stones are arranged in an ovoid shape approximately 50 meters across. From the western arc of that oval, spurs of stones extend outward, pointing with a precision that researchers from the University of Melbourne and CSIRO have confirmed toward the positions of the setting sun at the summer solstice, the winter solstice, and the equinoxes. The Wathaurong people are the traditional custodians of Wurdi Yuang, and they understand it as a site of cultural significance that predates anything the researchers' instruments can measure. The researchers, working with astronomical analysis and surface condition dating, have concluded that the alignments are intentional and precise. That this arrangement encodes a systematic knowledge of solar movement across the year, captured in stone in a form transmissible across generations. If the interpretation is correct, Wurdi Yuang is one of the oldest intentional astronomical observatories on Earth. Potentially older than Stonehenge, potentially older than the astronomical alignments at the megalithic sites of Western Europe that have received vastly more scholarly attention and vastly more cultural reverence from the civilization that later built observatories with lenses. Wurdi Yuang is not an isolated example. It is one well-documented instance of a tradition of astronomical knowledge that researchers in the history of science now acknowledge is the oldest continuous astronomical tradition on Earth. This is no longer a fringe claim. It is published in peer-reviewed academic journals by researchers from institutions including the Australian National University and the University of Southern Queensland. The astronomical tradition of Aboriginal Australia was not incidental knowledge or seasonal lore. It was systematic, it was precise, and it was old. The Burong people of northwestern Victoria maintained a detailed star catalogue, recorded by European observers in the 19th century, that identified and named individual stars, star clusters, and nebulae, described their properties and movements, and embedded them in a cosmological framework that explained their relationships to one another and to events on Earth. Some of the observations preserved in Burong tradition describe features of the night sky with a precision not achieved in European astronomy until the age of the telescope. The identification of the Eta Carinae nebula as a feature that varied in brightness was recorded in Burong tradition, framed as the behavior of a particular ancestral being before it was confirmed by European observational astronomy. John Herschel noted the nebula's variability in 1843 from his observatory in South Africa. The Burong had been tracking it for considerably longer. For Sydney specifically, the astronomical tradition of the Eora people is less completely documented than some other communities, largely because the intensity of disruption caused by the early colonial settlement was so severe and so rapid that the transmission of specialized knowledge was broken before it could be fully recorded. But what has been recovered through the work of Aboriginal knowledge holders and the researchers who work alongside them reveals a sophisticated astronomical culture intimately connected to the management of the natural environment. The orientation of rock engraving sites in the Sydney Basin has been examined for astronomical alignments, and some alignments have been proposed and discussed. The evidence is not always conclusive, and reading astronomical intent into rock art requires care. The risk of finding patterns in genuinely ambiguous data is real, but the tradition of solar and celestial orientation in the placement of significant cultural sites is well established in Aboriginal culture generally, and there is no reason to suppose the Sydney region was exceptional in lacking it. The practical astronomy of the Eora people was encoded in what Europeans would recognize as ecological knowledge. The timing of fishing activities by star positions, the use of celestial configurations to navigate the coast, the identification of specific star patterns with the seasonal availability of specific food resources. This is applied ecology encoded in astronomical observation, knowledge that took thousands of years of systematic attention to develop, and that functioned as an annual management calendar for the whole of the harbor and its hinterland. In the Blue Mountains west of Sydney, elevated positions offering clear views of the western horizon are associated in Aboriginal tradition with specific times of year defined by celestial events. The mountains were not simply a resource zone or a physical barrier. In the Aboriginal understanding of the landscape, they were an astronomical horizon, a place from which the sky could be read in ways that informed the management of the coastal country below them. The relationship between mountain and harbor was not just geographical. It was astronomical. It was calendrical. It was, in the most functional sense of the word, scientific. Now turn from the sky to the soil, because the ground beneath Sydney has been recording the history of what happened here with a precision that no political narrative can edit. Soil does not have reasons to be diplomatic. It absorbs what falls into it, compresses it in sequence, and holds it in the order of arrival. Building a stratigraphy that trained archaeologists can read the way a geologist reads a cliff face. The archaeological stratigraphy of the Sydney Basin has been examined in detail at a relatively small number of sites where construction or heritage work created the opportunity. What those examinations consistently find is occupation extending further back and running deeper than the standard historical narrative of Sydney acknowledges. The chemistry of soil at sites around the harbor tells a story that complements the stratigraphic record. Anthropogenic soil, soil substantially altered by long-term human presence, has distinctive chemical signatures. Elevated phosphorus from organic waste, carbon deposits from sustained fire use, pH, modifications from accumulated shellfish remains and ash over long periods. These signatures have been identified at multiple locations around the harbor in ways that indicate sustained, intensive occupation at specific sites over time periods considerably longer than the colonial period. The fire-modified landscape of the Sydney region is legible in pollen records preserved in sediments from wetlands and lakes within the basin. Analysis of those records shows vegetation change consistent with deliberate fire management. The composition of plant communities shifting in ways that correspond to systematic burning at intervals and intensities consistent with the mosaic burning practices documented in Aboriginal land management traditions. The earliest of these fire management signatures in the local pollen record extends back thousands of years, describing a landscape already being actively shaped by human choice. At the time, the earliest human occupation of the region was being established. The geological context adds a dimension that is easy to miss, but crucial to understanding the full scope of what was here. When sea levels were lower than they are today, which they were for most of the period of human occupation of the continent, the geography of the Sydney region was dramatically different. The harbor did not exist in its current form until approximately 10,000 years ago, when rising seas flooded the drowned Hawkesbury Nepean Valley, the land on which early people lived, on which their cultural activities took place across most of the period of Australian human occupation, is now underwater. The stories of the 30, 40, 50,000 years that preceded the harbor's formation are preserved primarily in the elevated sandstone country that remained above sea level and in the oral traditions of the people whose ancestors walked across a coastal plain that is now the floor of the Tasman Sea, the soil. This was an inhabited landscape of great depth and complexity. The inhabitants were shaping and managing it across an immense span of time. The act of building a colonial city on top of that landscape was not a beginning. It was a very recent chapter in a history whose earlier pages are still there, waiting under the streets, holding their information in the patient, uneditable way that soil and stone always do. The journals of the people who sailed with the first fleet are extraordinary documents. They are detailed, often perceptive, and occasionally breathtaking in the gap between what their authors described and what their authors understood. Reading them carefully. Reading with attention to what is mentioned in passing and not developed. To what is described without being analyzed. To what is noticed, and then set aside because it did not fit the narrative the writers were operating within, is one of the most illuminating exercises available to anyone who wants to understand what 1788 actually encountered when it arrived at Port Jackson. Arthur Phillip's dispatches to Lord Sydney are formal government documents shaped by the political context in which they were written. Phillip was reporting to his superiors on the progress of a colonial enterprise with specific objectives. He was not conducting an anthropological survey. He was establishing a penal colony and reporting on whether that enterprise was proceeding satisfactorily. The Aboriginal inhabitants were relevant in his dispatches primarily as either a potential threat to or a potential resource for the settlement's success. But even within these constraints, certain observations surfaced in his writing that repay close attention. Phillip noted early on that the Aboriginal people of the harbor region had well-established paths through the landscape, paths that the settlers found useful and followed. He described the country as open in ways that suggested ongoing management. Grass kept short, trees well-spaced in manners that facilitated travel. He observed that certain areas of the harbor and its hinterland were visited regularly by groups of Aboriginal people whose movements appeared to follow systematic patterns rather than random resource searches. These are the observations of a managed landscape and an organized population. They describe, in other words, exactly what you would expect to find if you had arrived at a place that had been inhabited and managed for tens of thousands of years by people who knew it intimately, what Phillip did not have, and what his political and legal context would not have permitted him to develop, even if he had the capacity, was a framework for recognizing what he was seeing as the evidence of a sophisticated civilization, rather than the natural characteristics of an empty land. Watkin Tench is perhaps the most valuable of the first fleet writers for understanding what was already here. His two accounts of the settlement, a narrative of the expedition to Botany Bay and a complete account of the settlement at Port Jackson, are remarkable for their intellectual honesty and their genuine curiosity about the Aboriginal people and culture he was observing. Tench was a marine officer, not an ethnographer, but he brought to his observations a quality of attention that many trained observers lack. He was interested in what he saw. He tried to understand it rather than simply categorize it. Tench described Aboriginal social organization in ways that, if taken seriously, significantly complicate the image of small, scattered bands of primitive hunter-gatherers that colonial historiography eventually settled on as its preferred account. He described clear social hierarchies. He described specialists within communities, individuals with specific knowledge functions, comparable, he noted, to the surgeons and priests and engineers of European society. He described trade goods and exchange relationships that implied connections to communities far beyond the harbor. He described structures, not grand architecture in the European sense, but permanent modifications of the landscape serving specific social functions. Cleared areas maintained as gathering places. Arrangements of stones marking territory or serving ceremonial purposes. Fish traps in the harbor that he identified as constructed features. A track network through the bush so well maintained that the settlers widened and formalized it into the roads their expanding settlement required. David Collins, the judge advocate of the settlement, produced a 2-volume account published in 1798 and 1802 that remains a primary documentary source for the early colonial period. Collins was more legalistic than either Philip or Tench, and his observations of Aboriginal culture are filtered through a legal and administrative sensibility. But they contain details of social organization, land tenure, and territorial definition that describe a system considerably more structured than the legal doctrine of terra nullius required. Terra nullius, the doctrine that declared Australia legally empty of people with rights of ownership or sovereignty, was the legal foundation of the entire colonial enterprise. It required that Aboriginal inhabitants be characterized as people without law, without property, without governance, and without the kind of organized social relationship with the land that would give them rights under international law. The journals of the First Fleet writers repeatedly describe evidence that contradicts this characterization. And this contradiction was not accidental. The journals were simply not widely read in ways that would have allowed their content to challenge the legal and political decisions being made about the continent's future. What Philip and Tench and Collins described, read carefully and in full context, is a society that had organized its relationship with the Sydney landscape over an immense span of time in ways that produced a functional, sophisticated, and stable human ecology. They did not describe wilderness. They described a place that had been, in the most meaningful sense of the word, built. The building they described did not look like London. It did not have stone walls and glass windows and numbered streets, but it was building nonetheless. The accumulated work of generations of people who understood their environment with a depth and precision that the people who arrived in 1788 did not possess and would not develop for many generations if they developed it at all. The journals are still there. They have been sitting in libraries and online archives for 236 years, describing what was found, waiting for readers who would pay attention to what they actually say, rather than to the story that was later constructed from selective excerpts. The founding documents of the colonial city, read honestly, describe a civilization that the founding myth of that city has consistently refused to see. The French observers of La Pérouse's expedition, which arrived in Botany Bay just days after the British First Fleet in January 1788, add another dimension that is easy to overlook. La Pérouse stayed for 6 weeks, and the journals of his naturalists contain independent observations of the Aboriginal people of the Botany Bay region. Independent in the sense that they carry no administrative stake in characterizing the local population in any particular way. What the French observers noted was that the Aboriginal people they encountered were not astonished by the arrival of ocean-going vessels and foreigners. They were wary, cautious, and in some cases willing to engage in exchange, but they were not bewildered. People who have never seen ships before and never encountered strangers from other cultures behave differently from people who carry an oral tradition of such encounters, who know that strangers sometimes arrive from the sea and that there are protocols for managing such arrivals. The behavior documented by both the British and French at Botany Bay in January 1788 is more consistent with the latter than the former. Language is a civilization's most complex technology, not in a metaphorical sense, in an engineering sense. It is the system that makes cumulative culture possible, the medium through which all knowledge is encoded, transmitted, refined, and passed forward. A sophisticated language is not an accident of biology. It is the product of thousands of years of refinement, the accumulated solution to the problem of representing a complex world in a form that minds can share. At the time of European contact, the continent of Australia was home to somewhere between 200 and 250 distinct languages, grouped into approximately 28 language families. The Pama-Nyungan family covered approximately 90% of the continent. A dense cluster of non-Pama-Nyungan languages occupied the northern and northwestern regions. This is a linguistic diversity comparable to pre-Roman Europe or to the Americas before contact, representing tens of thousands of years of linguistic development in geographic isolation. The languages of the Eora people of the Sydney region formed a dialect chain across which communities of the harbor and the surrounding coast and inland maintained communication while expressing distinct local identities. The coastal Darug of the Sydney Basin, the Darawal of the coast to the south, the Darkinyung and Gundungura of the mountains to the west, linguistically related but distinct, with shared vocabulary and grammatical structures alongside features marking community membership. The grammatical sophistication of these languages is not a matter of academic debate. They contain features that European linguists found genuinely puzzling when they first studied them, because those features do not appear in European languages and required new analytical frameworks to describe. Consider the inclusive-clusive distinction in the first-person plural, the capacity to distinguish between we that includes you and we that excludes you, present in Darug and many other Australian languages, is a grammatical feature that encodes a social reality with precision that English lacks entirely. You are either inside the we or you are outside it, and the language forces the speaker to specify which every single time. Consider the evidential systems of many Australian languages. Grammatical markers that specify whether the speaker is reporting direct observation, inference, or hearsay. This encodes an epistemological precision, a built-in system for distinguishing between what you witnessed, what you concluded, and what you heard, that academic philosophy has only recently begun to formalize as a serious field of study. The vocabulary of the Sydney languages reflects an environment known with extraordinary intimacy. specific words for the state of the harbor at different tidal stages, specific words for the appearance of the sky at different points in weather systems, specific words for the behavior of fish at different seasons, specific words for the growth stages of particular food plants, specific words for different qualities of sandstone, for the conditions of the bush after different patterns of burning. This vocabulary was not assembled in a generation. It is the accumulation of experience encoded in language across a span of time that makes the colonial period look negligible. When a language is lost, you do not simply lose the words. You lose the ways of thinking that the words were vehicles for, the relationships between concepts that the language encoded in its structure, the practical knowledge about the world embedded in its vocabulary. Those ways of thinking often encoded knowledge that took millennia to develop and cannot be reconstructed from first principles in any reasonable time frame. The language reclamation movement among the Aboriginal communities of the Sydney region is one of the most significant cultural developments of recent decades. The Darug language has been partially reconstructed from early colonial word lists, from linguistic analysis of names and words that survived in colonial records in various degrees of distortion, and from oral traditions maintained by community members through the colonial period. The work is painstaking and imperfect, but it is happening. The Darug Custodians Aboriginal Corporation and the researchers who work with them have made substantial progress in recovering and systematizing the language. Darug is being taught to children. It is being spoken at public events and ceremonies. It is being used in the naming of places and institutions in ways that restore its presence in the landscape it was developed to describe. The place names of the Sydney region that survived into the colonial and post-colonial record are windows into the linguistic knowledge system of the pre-contact people. Woolloomooloo, Parramatta, Kirribilli, Manly, Turramurra, Cabramatta. These and hundreds of others are Eora and Darug words that entered the colonial record because the settlers found them practically useful as geographic labels and retained them even as they systematically suppressed the language itself. Their retention is somewhat ironic and wholly appropriate. The city that the settlers built on Aboriginal land was named in large part in Aboriginal languages. Those names are pronounced by tens of millions of people every day, a daily practice of linguistic connection to the pre-colonial world, whether or not the speakers are aware of it. Every time someone mentions Parramatta, they are speaking Darug. Every time someone says Woolloomooloo, the language of the people whose country was taken is present in the mouths of the people who took it, persisting in plain sight. The dreaming, sometimes called the dream time, though the English term misrepresents the concept in important ways, refers not to a past time in which ancestral events occurred, as the word dreamtime implies, but to an ongoing condition of reality in which the ancestral and the present are not separate domains but interpenetrating aspects of a single, continuous existence. The stories of the dreaming are not myths in the sense of fictional accounts of the past. They are accounts of the real structure of the world, encoded in narrative form and transmitted through ceremony and performance and landscape. In the Eora dreaming traditions, the formation of Sydney Harbour is itself a subject of narrative. The harbour was created by the travels and actions of ancestral beings whose presence is preserved in specific geographic features, particular headlands, particular rock formations, particular underwater features visible at low tide. The stories that describe these features encode information about the formation of the landscape that, in some instances, corresponds to geological events the oral tradition could only have preserved through continuous transmission across tens of thousands of years. One of the most striking demonstrations of this deep historical memory is the evidence for oral preservation of sea level changes that occurred at the end of the last ice age. As global temperatures rose and ice sheets melted, roughly between 14,000 and 6,000 years ago, what rising seas flooded the continental margins and transformed the geography of coastal Australia. Several Aboriginal communities along the Australian coast maintain oral traditions that appear to preserve memories of specific sea level rise events, describing the submersion of lands that are now underwater in language that correlates with specific geographical changes rather than general mythological themes. The Yolngu people of Arnhem Land have such traditions. Communities along the south and southwest coasts describe the drowning of land that can be matched to specific phases of sea level rise in those areas. In the Sydney region, oral traditions of the Eora people include references to the harbour that suggest an awareness of its formation as a relatively recent event in the deep history of the landscape. This understanding is geologically accurate. The harbour did not always exist. It formed when the sea rose and flooded the Hawkesbury Nepean Valley approximately 10,000 years ago. The people living on the coastal plain watched it happen, and the memory of what they witnessed was preserved in oral traditions that their descendants carried across the following 10,000 years. 10,000 years of oral transmission, the oldest written historical records from anywhere on Earth. The Sumerian tablets from Mesopotamia date to approximately 5,000 years before the present. The oral traditions of the Eora people are at least twice as old and almost certainly older. The dreaming is not primitive religion. It is not naive mythology. It is a sophisticated knowledge system that uses narrative, ceremony, and landscape as the medium of transmission for a historical and scientific archive of extraordinary depth maintained across a span of time that makes all of written human history look brief. The trade networks that connected the Sydney region to the wider continental system are among the least visible and most significant achievements of pre-colonial Australian civilization. Stone axes from quarries in central Queensland, found in archaeological sites in Victoria and South Australia. Ochre from the Flinders Ranges, traveling to communities who valued its specific color and quality for ceremonial purposes. Pearl shell from the northwest coast, found at sites in the desert interior thousands of kilometers from any ocean. Turi, the preparation made from native tobacco, moving in the opposite direction from inland to coastal communities. The mechanisms of this trade were sophisticated. Some goods moved through chains of exchange in which each party traded with their nearest neighbors, and the goods accumulated the distances of many such exchanges without anyone necessarily making the full journey. Other goods traveled with ceremonial parties who held rites of passage through multiple territories because they were fulfilling obligations that transcended any single group's boundaries. The paths along which these goods and people moved were not random. They were specific routes, named and maintained, following the contours of the landscape in ways that reflected accumulated knowledge of water sources, food resources, and the territories of every community through which they passed. The Sydney region sat at one edge of this continental network. Its coastal communities connected through inland groups and through maritime trade routes running along the eastern seaboard from Cape York to Bass Strait. Goods and knowledge and people moved along this coastal corridor in patterns that required both the navigational knowledge to use the sea safely and the social knowledge of who held what rights and obligations at each point along the route. The canoes of the Eora people were built for these conditions, made from bark, stripped from specific trees at specific times of year, to produce the right combination of flexibility and waterproofing, formed into shapes refined over thousands of years of uses in the specific waters of this harbor and this coast. When the first fleet officers observed these craft in the harbor in 1788, they were seeing the product of a boat-building tradition whose development had run in parallel with the entire period of Aboriginal occupation, a tradition as old as the settlement itself. The question the city of Sydney now confronts is not only historical. The ecological crisis facing the greater Sydney region, the degradation of the harbor, the loss of urban biodiversity, the management of water and green space, and coastal environments in the face of climate change. These are problems the founding culture created, and that the current culture is struggling to solve. They are problems the Aboriginal people of the region did not create, and their solutions may require incorporating the knowledge systems of the people who managed this landscape successfully for 65,000 years. This is not a romanticized claim that pre-colonial management was perfect, or that its principles can be transplanted wholesale into the management of a modern city of 5 million people. It is a practical observation. 65,000 years of successful ecological management on a specific landscape constitutes an evidence base. Ignoring that evidence base, particularly when the management system that replaced it is producing demonstrably negative outcomes, is not caution. It is a specific kind of blindness with documented consequences. The legal landscape has shifted in ways that acknowledge what the historical narrative spent 2 centuries denying. The Mabo decision of 1992, the High Court case brought by Eddie Koiki Mabo and other Meriam people of the Murray Islands, overturned the doctrine of terra nullius and established that Australian common law recognizes native title, that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have rights to their land deriving from their prior occupation. The Mabo decision did not overturn 2 centuries of colonial land grants and dispositions. but it fundamentally altered the legal framework within which the relationship between the Australian state and its indigenous peoples is understood. In effect, it was a judicial acknowledgement that something was here before 1788, that the land had people, that those people had a legal relationship with their land that deserved recognition, that the founding myth of the empty continent was not simply historically wrong, but legally wrong, and that its legal wrongness had consequences the Australian legal system was obligated to address. Native title determinations have been made in the Sydney region, formally recognizing the continuing connection of specific Aboriginal groups to specific areas of their country within the modern city. The office, towers, and roads and harbour foreshore continue in their colonial configurations, but the legal and symbolic landscape has changed in ways that matter. The welcome to country ceremonies now standard at public events across Australia, in which an elder of the local Aboriginal community formally acknowledges their continuing connection to and authority over the country on which the event is held, are not simply protocol. They are ceremonies of recognition performed in the middle of the modern city on country that has not stopped being country simply because it has been built on. They invoke a continuity of presence and authority that extends back past 1788 to the actual beginning of human occupation in this place. Knowing that Sydney was built on Aboriginal country and having that knowledge genuinely shape the way you understand the city you live in are different things. The difference matters because what you do not know about where you live limits your capacity to understand it fully, to care for it appropriately, to make good decisions about its future. A city that does not know its own history is a city making decisions in partial darkness. There is a particular quality of light in Sydney Harbour in the hour before dawn. The water goes from black to a deep blue-gray that has no exact name in English. The sandstone of the headlands catches the first pale light in the east and holds it differently on different surfaces, depending on their angle and composition, and the degree to which they have been worked or worn. In that light, in that hour, the harbour looks ancient in a way the daytime does not quite capture, because the daytime fills with activity and noise, and the visual language of the present. The pre-dawn hour is quiet enough that the deep time of the place becomes perceptible, not as an idea, but as a felt quality of the air and the stone and the water. The sandstone has been in its current form for approximately 250 million years. The harbour has been in its current form for approximately 10,000 years. The people who have been living on its shores have been there for at least 65,000 years. The city, built on top of all of this, has been there for 236 years. These numbers are not statistics. They are an invitation to a different way of thinking about what Sydney is, and what it means, and what it rests on. What was already here? When the sails appeared over the heads in January 1788, was a civilization. The word is inadequate because the word carries connotations of specifically European forms of social organization. Cities, monuments, written laws, standing armies that were used as the measure of all human achievement by the ideology that arrived with those ships. What was built in the Sydney region over 65,000 years was not a European civilization. It was something the European category does not contain. Something more durable and more complex, and more specifically adapted to its place than most of what the European concept of civilization has produced. It was built in knowledge and in relationship, in the intricate, multi-generational work of understanding a specific place so completely that you become inseparable from it. In the rock art that carries the record of what was observed and known, in the hydraulic engineering that fed populations for millennia without depleting the systems it depended on, in the trade networks that moved knowledge and goods across a continent, in the astronomical traditions that turned the night sky into a management calendar for the living world below it, in the languages that encoded the landscape's complexity with a precision that took thousands of years to develop and cannot be reconstructed in a generation. That kind of building lasts. It lasts because it is not built in materials that can be demolished. It is built in the patterns of land and water and sky, in the memory of the people who have moved through those patterns for longer than memory usually reaches, in the ceremony that transmits it, in the care for country that expresses it. Sydney was not built in 1788. Sydney was found in 1788. What it found was a city of a different kind, older and quieter and deeper than anything the arriving ships were carrying, already built into the stone and the water and the knowledge of the people who had been making it carefully and with great deliberation for 65,000 years. The ledge of sandstone above the waterline, the one we began with, the one worn smooth in ways that stone does not wear smooth on its own, with grooves too regular and too deep for anything but human. Intention is still there. It has been there since before the harbor had a European name, since before there was a city on its shores. It will be there after the city has been replaced by whatever comes next, holding in its worked surface the record of the hands that shaped it, the intention that guided those hands, the knowledge that made the intention possible. That is what Sydney was built on. That is what was already there. The sandstone knows. It has always known. And the harbor knows. And the sky over the heads at dawn is the same sky that every dawn for 65,000 years has revealed to the people who were already here. The question is not whether they were here. The question is what it means that the city built on their country is only now beginning to ask.